This is really a starting point for everybody. So some of this, if you're an expert in working with generative AI or AI in general, you may want to go make a sandwich or something like that. This is not probably the session for you, but it is for those of you that I have talked with before who've been in prior sessions. What's most interesting for me on the receiving end of these sorts of sessions is in an hour or so, can I walk away with something that I can immediately use, something that's useful, not a lot of theory, but really what can I do in practice? So with that, we'll talk about this idea of how we can use generative AI for project and program managers. And hopefully everyone can see the screen okay with our cyborg Jaguar over here. We're going to talk about a brief introduction, and I mean very brief, as far as about AI in general, including generative AI. Very briefly, because LitheSpeed, we are an agile and lean consultancy, but we're advocates of agile and lean ways of working. So we really want to align quickly on how we can align AI and agile values. Some immediate useful applications for project and program managers. And this is really the area where I hope all of you who are doing the day-to-day project or program management find some of these things useful. I think they are incredibly valuable and can be used immediately. We'll talk about a couple of real-world examples of generative AI in use today that is expanding. I said to one of the folks I was working with as I was preparing for today's session, I originally built this deck 3 months ago, and was saying, I don't know how much, do I need to go back and revise it, how quickly the industry is changing. But we've got some good examples of generative AI in use for practical purposes today that I'll share with you. Want to talk about the risks and limitations of AI. So you get excited about this stuff and some good things you can do. I'm going to kill that vibe for just a little bit and say, what are some of the risks and limitations to be cognizant of? Still proceed, but be cognizant of some of these risks so you don't get into trouble. And then moving forward, some next steps. So with that, this is me. Always feels a little bit weird to have a picture of me while I'm actually on your screen talking to folks, but it does allow me to do Scrabble tiles, and that's great. So I'm the Vice President of Consulting at LitheSpeed. I'm also the Vice President of Professional Development for the PMI chapter in Northern Nevada here. So I'm a project manager, program manager by trade for a number of years. And I'm passionate about this. I have been in the seats that a number of you have been in as well. And so it's really important for me to try to give back to my fellow PMs. I've spent way too long, this is dangerously close to 30 years in technology throughout the SDLC, about 15 or so years of that in senior leadership roles. Probably what's most important for today, though, is that I was the SVP for customer service, innovation, user experience, and product management for around 6 years at an artificial intelligence company in Washington State that was heavily based on doing natural language processing. So I've seen a lot of this firsthand, less on the generative side, but just AI in general. And that informs some of my perspectives on how it's useful and also areas to be careful about its use. Would be happy to connect with anybody on LinkedIn, unless you only want to sell something, in which case I'm probably not the right guy to connect with, but otherwise I'm happy to share thoughts. Would welcome joining your network. And thanks you all again for taking the time today for this session. And I look forward to share these ideas with you and get your thoughts. So with that, defining AI and agility. So what is AI? And I think most folks may know this by now, but again, it's important for me in these sorts of sessions to make sure that we have a sort of foundational level of shared understanding. So AI, artificial intelligence, is an umbrella in ways like Agile is an umbrella, and then we have frameworks and approaches underneath like Scrum and Kanban. AI is an umbrella with things like machine learning, natural language processing, generative AI, and robotics, among others. It creates human-like intelligent systems. We can argue about how much human-like they are or are not. I posted something recently about anthropomorphizing AI, generative AI, and whether AI can have empathy. That is outside the scope of today's conversation, but human-like emulation of human systems. It learns from data, and I should just say in parentheses, lots and lots and lots and lots of data using algorithms, and then can automate tasks and optimize processes. talking about that as a jumping off point of AI in general, what we're really going to be focused on today, though, is generative artificial intelligence. And so that's a subset, again, of that overarching umbrella of AI. So Gen AI for short, because we have to have acronyms in our industry, obviously, it's required by tradition and probably contract somewhere, is short for generative artificial intelligence. It's that subset of AI that focuses on creating and generating data and other sorts of content. Here's where that mimicking human behavior, emulating human behavior, generative AI responses can mimic that human-like creativity and ingenuity. Whether generative AI can totally be creative is also a philosophical, not technical debate and outside the scope of today's conversation. But it is an interesting debate, and one that I'm sure will continue quite aggressively as we continue into the expansion of generative AI everywhere. Traditional AI systems primarily work with predefined rules and patterns, where generative AI is just, become ridiculously ubiquitous in pretty much everything that we're all talking about and reading about in our news and on LinkedIn feeds and beyond today, is that it is new in the sense that it can produce new and original information, derivative works, synthetic works, that include things such as text, images, and music. So it's a really big change in terms of the overall umbrella of artificial intelligence. Generative AI has really changed the nature of how much all of us, the work that we do on a daily basis, or is about to if it hasn't already. So I talked about, again, the scope of these meetups and this live stream. We are proponents of agile ways of working, agilists, et cetera, of different titles, but we're folks who are proponents generally of agile ways of working, lean ways of working. So how do we align AI and agile values? I usually say that it's similar to when you look at money. Money is not inherently good or bad. It's fungible. What you spend it on means it's, whether it's good or bad. And it's the same idea here with AI. It's not inherently in support of or in conflict with agile values. It just depends on how you apply it. But here's some ideas on how, when we look through the lens of the manifesto, how AI can use to support and amplify agile ways of working. And here's just a couple. But this idea of individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Well, AI tools can help us. These chatbots or virtual assistants can help facilitate team communication. They can help us assist with routine tasks. That's some of what we'll talk about today. The superpower to me overall with generative AI is, how can it free up the time that doesn't require my brain and my heart to automate those tasks, to optimize those tasks, so that I can use my brain and my heart on the things that actually matter, that are unique to my humanity. From this idea of working solutions over comprehensive documentation from the manifesto. So in a lot of instances, those of us in the PM world, we still have to have documentation. It can be lightweight, it can be heavyweight, but it's something that we have to do. That can really be a chore that I would say certainly doesn't require my heart and often doesn't require my brain. How can I use these tools so that I can optimize creation of those artifacts that I need to create, but that there's not really a value add in much sense of what my brain or heart is adding to them? Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So here's where we can use things like the analytics that can be provided through these tools to help us interact better with customers. And it's not unique to generative AI tools, but that's certainly an area where I found some amazing capabilities to really zoom into some issues and even provide some potential ideas on how to better engage where there is a challenge through these tools, because they're looking for patterns. And most issues that we have in customer communication, those are patterns or anti-patterns that we've seen elsewhere. So this is a really good area where these tools can help us with this overarching principle and value of customer collaboration. And then responding to change over following a plan. Similarly, using the data that these huge large language models have can help see those patterns and help us understand issues before they occur, those patterns that are emergent or even before we would even see them emergent. That'll allow us to see issues and mitigate them, address them before they become much more of a larger issue that's difficult to actually manage at that point. So this is just sort of a start about how AI can, again, be in supportive, actively help amplify Agile values that we have, and really help us to be able to focus on the things that really matter. So here's the part when I talk about when I'm on the receiving end in these sorts of meetups, what I find most useful. What do I walk away from? So we're at 12:15 Eastern. We've got 45 minutes. Here's some things that I hope those of you who are doing day-to-day project management work will get some good ideas, because these are the things that you can use today. I use ChatGPT, the paid version, for these options, but Claude and some of the other tools that are out there, Gemini, likely will be able to do very similar constructs. So ChatGPT is my example, but these are things you can do today. If you've got a project that you're just getting started with, see what you think about this. I think these are some things that you can actually just use, starting at 1 o'clock. Wait until we're actually done with today's session, start at 1. But I think you might find this useful. So with that, we'll start this journey. When you start using these tools, if you're not familiar with this, this is a really, really important construct, not just through this project management lens, but for any interactions you're using with these tools. If you really want to get the best from them, if you want the best outputs, you want to provide good inputs. When you're prompting, you want to use the following, and there's some different constructs, but I would really suggest starting here, and then you can read about some different approaches that are different takes on this general idea. But think in terms of the role. So as a, sort of goes back to our user stories, right? As a project manager, I would like to, but if you specify the role that you are in when you're creating these prompts, or for the persona, if you're designing it for a specific audience, either of those are really valuable in your inputs to specify, so that the content is really tailored towards that audience. And that's really, really important. If you're dealing with a business executive versus dealing with a software engineer or a director from the PMO, those different levels, if you specify those roles or those titles, will help orient the responses, the level of depth, detail, and focus that you'll get. So always specify the role when you're doing those inputs to get you started to get a better quality output. The next is the audience. So I talked about, sort of the role. What's your role? But who are you creating? If you're creating an artifact or a response or whatever that case may be, who do you want that to be targeted to? So I've used the examples of executives. If I'm tailoring the same content about this project overview, I've got the same data, but if I characterize that as my audience is for executives, there's going to likely be a very different focus than if it is for fellow project managers or for project team members. Could be the exact same starting point for the content, but how that information is presented, distilled, summarized is going to be unique to those audiences. And that is definitely a superpower of these tools. What's the context? So in many cases, we are approaching this with a need, and in some cases, it is a problem or a challenge that we're trying to address, or an opportunity that we want to take advantage of. So here's just a couple of examples, but if you provide the context, I'm building this training for, I am building this project plan for, but if you provide context for that, this is a project that we know is going to be on a compressed time schedule. We've had issues hitting our dates before, whatever those sorts of things are, provide that in the context, and that will help inform the level of detail that you get out. Format. So often when you are generating inputs for these tools, it's implicit, at least in your head. When I did this initially in my head, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it in a PowerPoint deck as a set of slides in an outline. And then realized, well, I can just say, put that output in the form of a PowerPoint outline, and it will dutifully arrange that information in that structure. And you can tell it to use tables, you can tell it to use an export file, but be specific about what you want that output format to be, and it will generally do much, if not all, of the heavy lifting on your behalf. And then finally, the length. So in many cases, the first response, if you don't specify this, I found this out firsthand. If I ask for something, it will give me even if I say bullet points, will give me 13 to 20 bullet points that can be very verbose, multiple pages. So I can use language like saying be high level, but I also will often say, for whatever reason, it doesn't count numerically quite well, but you can say around 100 words and you'll get around 100 words, 5 sentences, those sorts of things. So you can really think about, again, based on how you're presenting this information to whom in what format. If you're doing a PowerPoint deck, you don't want to have thousands and thousands of words. So think about the length as well as the format to make sure that what you're providing is going to be the right level of fit for what your purpose is. So hopefully that's successful. Hopefully that is helpful as far as these suggestions. This is, again, not unique to using this in the context of project or program management. Anytime you use these tools for any purpose, start with these ideas to get better quality outputs. So what I'm going to walk through are a number of related examples, and I'll explain why they're related and where I think this is really the superpower. We're going to start with, again, we're project and program managers. We need some help with project planning and scheduling. So project planning is a challenge for the best and most experienced PMs. When we leverage GenAI for this process, again, one of the overarching points that I'll say is I use this as a starting point. I would never say take the final copy and just go use that, but it's a good place to get started, and then you can add and refine on your own. This is a great way to start. But GenAI can really help with establishing realistic timelines for each phase, especially in instances, a lot of PMs, even if we're trying to move towards this product-based world, a lot of us are going to be working on projects or programs that we don't have a lot of domain experience for. And that is another superpower of these tools, is that it has baked in domain experience in areas where we may not. So in this particular example, you can see on the right-hand side, these are real copy-paste inputs and responses to my prompts from, again, GPT-4. But I started off by saying, generate a project timeline from migrating to an on-premise instance of Microsoft Exchange to the cloud version, and note how I'm adding more details. And the more details you add, the better the results are going to be. For a 50-person company, leveraging just the basic features of the product, and ensure that there's a step for MFA, TFA, so multi-factor, two-factor authentication. I want to make sure that I've got a multi-factor authentication mechanism baked into that. I've provided a good level of detail. So again, this isn't like typing into a search engine, and that's another key issue that folks often run into, is this is not a search engine, even though you have an input box that looks very familiar. So I provided a lot of that detail, 50 people, on-prem to cloud. And I want just the basic features. So providing those additional pieces of context is going to help get me a good, not just a good response, but it's going to inform its suggestions on what those phases would be. And you can see it's, without my asking it to, it's enumerated what would be the plan with those high-level actions that would be happening in those steps. For me, great place to start. Not a great place to end. And here's where I really see the superpower of these tools. So my next response, continuing in this conversation, just again, dangerous, I think, to anthropomorphize AI too much. But if I think about it, if I'm having a conversation, I see my friend Johnny here, so I'm looking at him. He's on screen. He happens to be right up here. Say, hey, Johnny, let's work on this plan together for this Exchange migration. And Johnny asked me that, and I give him this plan, the one that you just saw. And Johnny says, that's great, buddy, but you're supposed to be a proponent of agile ways of working. Make this plan more agile and iterative. So in this particular instance, the response is to make this plan more agile and iterative. Keeping the context from what I had provided, I don't have to say, again, what this project is about, the lowest level of details. It takes what I provided. It takes this more agile and iterative. And again, I wasn't prescriptive other than just saying make more agile and iterative. And you can see it then refines the plan itself it breaks them into sprints. It talks about the objectives of what would be in each of those sprints. So it's taking that same idea, but it's representing it in a completely different construct, but not just different buckets of 2-week periods, but what is happening in those periods, and just a fundamentally different and more agile approach to be looking at. So that context really is a superpower. And what you'll see in terms of how I use this, and I suggest you try using it, is what's the line from the movie Clueless? Never accept the first offer. So I'll reuse that line in this context from that wonderful movie and just say, keep refining based on what you get back from that context. Refine this plan based on additional prompts. I want this to be more agile. From that, though, I now have at least the framework of a plan that is more agile for this migration. But good PMs, what are some things that we need to do? Agile or traditional PMs, we need to help understand how we're managing risk and how we're mitigating that risk. So my continued prompt in that conversation, just like I'm talking to my buddy Johnny says, generate a risk identification and mitigation plan for this project. And from that same context, you can see that it starts providing some ideas on risks that would be here. Now, again, I'll say this on every slide, in repeating by design. Don't just go off with this list and say, I've got a complete list. Some of these answers may be ones that are not appropriate or applicable for you, and it may be missing some. So take this as a first draft, as an opening offer, but don't end there. But again, if I haven't ever done a Microsoft Exchange migration, maybe I'm a software project manager, and I'm not really familiar with this sort of migration from an on-prem physical infrastructure to a cloud-based. It identifies some risks that I may not know of if I've not done this type of work before. And that's where it's really great. Data loss during migration. I may not have even thought about the fact that we might lose some data. What are we going to do to manage that? So not only does it identify what the risks are, but it provides some mitigation steps for each of those. Even if you could do this, and many of you have, I'm sure, could do this on your own, how nice is it for this technology to do the first 50 to 95% of that work for you? You get to use your heart and your brain really thinking about other things and refining this, but you don't have to do sort of the basic table stakes type stuff in these instances. But again, some other good examples that we may not have thought of, especially if we haven't done these sorts of migrations before: downtime impacting business operations, security vulnerabilities. So it really helps us get up to speed on things to be cognizant of for our risk management plan and mitigation. So from that, again, the superpower for me, the thing that just blew me away in different scenarios, it was valuable in each of these independent use cases, but chaining them together I just was stunned by how useful and usable that was. So from that, on the prior slide, we now have a risk identification and mitigation approach. But now I need to figure out how should I communicate to stakeholders about that status. Now I know what I'm going to be managing and monitoring. I know the things that I should be looking for, but I know that I need to communicate that to people. It's not something that I do in isolation. So provide an approach to communicate and align stakeholders on our risk management status. And from there, that continued context. Again, I may know all of this stuff. I may know some of this stuff. Even if I know it, the superpower is also that it just saves me a lot of time. Identifying those stakeholders, develop that communication plan, create a risk management dashboard. Now, you may say in your organization, it's not practical for us to create a risk management dashboard or we send reports. This is where your unique context is something that you use your brain and your business domain relationship, all of those other specific context understandings to decide what you want to keep or change or get rid of. But this gives you a really great start, regardless of what your context. And then your job is really to figure out what to add, modify, or remove. So if I'm inherently lazy and or efficient, sometimes I say them synonymously, But continuing on that, so I've got this plan, I've got this communication strategy from that prior slide. I'm not going to stop there. I want it to create a PowerPoint template for me that I can use for sharing that information to my stakeholders. It has all of that context. And again, I don't have to worry about copying and pasting or anything like that. It takes that data seamlessly from those prior prompts and those responses to assist with the documentation. And then you can see here, it breaks them out by what it proposes would be on the slide. It even has things like what graphic you may want to consider. So again, you can take that advice, you can evolve that advice, refine it, get rid of it, but it gives you a really good starting point. And then the agenda, again, I may want to modify this agenda for things that I think are important, things that are different, things that are missing, things that are superfluous in my context that I get rid of. But this gives me a great place to start. So my job, again, on this one is just choosing what to add, modify, or delete, but I'm somewhere between 50 to 95% of the way there. So continuing on that, think of all of these things that we do, Agile or traditional project or program management, these artifacts that we require. They take different forms depending on if they're traditional waterfall type projects or Agile-based projects, but whether it's lightweight or heavyweight, there's documentation that's going to be required. So let's have GenAI help us with that as well. So in this particular instance, I want an Agile project charter from that data. So again, same context, no copying and pasting, no starting from scratch. It already knows what the project title is. I didn't provide the vision or the justification, but based on, this is a fairly common pattern. If your case is going to be for your project very unique, some of these things may not be as easy, but for common things, an on-prem to cloud-based migration, it's going to propose some things that just make sense because a lot of other people are doing them for the same reasons. Things like, why do we want to move towards a cloud-based solution? And so it already provides those justifications. Again, you can refine them, but you've got a great starting point. We talk about in the charter. So again, I said Agile project charter, that's where adding that additional adjective completely changes how it presents what we're doing. So this idea of in the charter, what are our principles about how we're going to run this as an Agile project? The objectives may be the same, but our principles about how do we evolve, how do we collaborate, how do we deliver things iteratively, it wove those in here. I didn't have to say anything other than Agile project charter. Based on that one adjective, it changed the structure and some of the content and approach for the charter preemptively to talk about what is Agile about what we're doing. Continuing on that, again, the things that we as PMs do as we're kicking off a project, we're going to have to do budgeting and resource allocation. Anybody who's ever been in one of these sessions with me, public sessions or private sessions, training organizations, and those sorts of things. I hate calling human beings resources. We will talk about resource management in this context, both the human beings that we sometimes refer to as resources, but also other resources on projects like this. There are other resources, tangible and intangible, that are related. So when we talk about that resource allocation and budgeting, we'll look at that in the broadest view of the word resource. But this is something that a lot of us are going to need to do as part of our project initiation. So again, same context. I just said, provide me an additional budget and resource allocation model for this project. What you'll see here, and thankfully it doesn't try to provide things like what the estimated cost is. That would just be all sorts of badness. But it does tell us that that's a variable that we need to define and populate for this so that we can understand what the budget's going to be. The thing that I thought was really useful in this, in addition to the fact that it just makes the work that we do a lot easier and more efficient, is that it sets up that structure, but it also helps with some things that we don't always think about. And some of us do have our organizational change management hat on when we're kicking off a project. But for those of us who are PMs, how many of us have been through sessions where the project itself cost millions of dollars And then there was little to no money that was allocated for actual training and organizational change management. That was one of the key areas that I thought was valuable. Is when I asked for a budget breakdown for this migration, it put in what those training costs would be. Didn't say what they would be, but what are the sorts of changes that we may need to contemplate in terms of organizational change management or training for the move towards the new product. So you can see where that would be something that we might often forget about, or sort of underestimate the importance of that. I find it's also a really good sort of peer review, again, trying to avoid anthropomorphizing, but it effectively is a peer review of what I would be thinking about in terms of the items that I would want to be budgeting for. And I think that that is really valuable. So when we talk again about the human aspect of resources, human resources, who do we need for this? And again, I before said that this was an agile project, that we wanted to manage it in an agile way of working. So it called out that we need a project manager or scrum master. But you can see, again, if this was a traditional project, it would not only say just project manager, but it likely would explain that role differently. And I find, again, this is very valuable, that context, even at the level of what this role will be doing on this project, it brings in that level of detail. If you're an agile project manager or a scrum master who is helping manage this work, I mean, you understand what your role is, but it's really helpful for organizations that are new to agile ways of working to sort of understand the differences in those roles as well for efforts like this. Technical team, this is interesting as well. Again, remember I said 50 people, that's a relatively small number of users. So when it said technical team, 2 to 3 IT professionals, if this was a 50,000 user migration, I'm pretty confident that there would be a lot more than 2 to 3 people that were there. So that context that I provided at the very beginning informs like all of the responses that I'm getting out of it. And so back to the more context you provide in your inputs, the more specific and higher quality and likely applicable the responses are going to be for your unique needs. So be as specific as you can to get the best quality results. Also based on this and sort of an understanding of the scope, an external consultant specifically for the multi-factor, two-factor authentication. This is, again, one of those ones that blew me away. Of it didn't just say we need X number of individuals working on this. It knew enough about the fact that most organizations don't likely have somebody who is an expert in those technologies for multi-factor authentication. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But if I extrapolate from the fact that I only had 50 users, I probably don't have enough users that my IT org would be big enough that we'd have experts in that area. That's the sort of benefit that you get from that level of specificity and that capacity as well. And you can see some of the other individuals. Training coordinator, like I said, I'm embarrassed to say this, but when I first was thinking about it, I wasn't even thinking about training being a component of it. You move from on-prem to cloud version and there's no real difference, although there can be. So it added training, but it also added to the staffing model, the training coordinator, and then support staff. I mean, who is going to actually support the migration? We often think about that, but sometimes it's an afterthought. So that becomes really valuable for us to really be looking at those elements, not just the core things. We know we need a PM or a Scrum Master or both. We know we've got a technical team. We may have even thought about those external consultants for specialties, but training coordinator, support staff, maybe we're not even thinking about those things through the lens of that sort of effort, especially if you haven't done these sorts of migrations before. Isn't it nice to have this technology really help hold you by the hand and guide you towards thinking about some things that are on the periphery of the work, but that are really essential to actually making it a successful project migration? So when I said that not all resources, we don't use that just about people in this context. So technical resources. So maybe I know about these, but again, especially if I'm new to this type of project, I may not be thinking about these things, or even if I am, it's really nice to have a way that an expert, my GenAI buddy here, my counterpart, is helping be an expert for me and telling me the things that I might need for technical resources. Some of them are pretty obvious, like we're going to need a subscription to Microsoft Exchange or 365. That's what we're moving towards. But migration tools, I mean, how am I actually migrating the data? I don't know what that is. Microsoft, I'm sure, has a tool for it, but I want to know what that is. And so it's good that it's reminding me, hey, we have to go from point A to point B. What tooling should we use? And if there's more than one option, what tooling should we choose? Backup and storage. So if we're moving over a ton of data, we need to be cognizant of whether or not we have enough storage space for that temporary move, what our network infrastructure looks like. So again, all of these, you may just say, no issue, check the box. But it's good to know what that pre-flight checklist is, as an analogy, like to look at these things and to validate things that we think we need to do. And in some cases, again, if we don't have that experience, to give us the ideas of the core things that we likely are going to need to do. And then security tools. If I'm new to using MFA or TFA, what tools do we need to use to implement that? So that is, it doesn't tell us which one to use, doesn't tell us how to implement it, but it definitely reminds us that that's part of what we need to identify and then implement. And then provide some additional time allocation for some of these efforts as well. So a couple of last slides that I've added here, and I think we'll have some time for some questions as well. So the next couple of slides are not unique to Agile ways of working per se, but I've added them based on some conversations that I've had lately on LinkedIn and beyond for project managers who are looking to move into a different area or who are looking to move from traditional waterfall project management to Agile ways of working. And I've just found that this is for all PMs. These are some things that can be really helpful beyond my Microsoft Exchange migration. So one of them that came up from the PMI chapter that I'm honored to be part of the leadership team, a project manager moving from construction projects who wants to move into software development, project management. That's a big leap. Not all project management is created the same. There's material differences. But if I wanted to make that move, GenAI can help with those sorts of things as well. So I provided this input. I'm a project manager, again, that context. I'm a project manager for construction projects, but I'd like to start moving into project management for software development. What should I do to get started? And here it starts to give me some ideas here of the things that I can do. Now, do all of these make sense? First blush, I would say this is probably a good place to start, but at least it gives me some ideas. I don't have to do all of them, but it gives me some ideas to work with. Again, think of it as a first draft, not a final list. Don't just follow it verbatim. But if you approach it as somebody giving you some ideas to start with, that's a great place to start. So in this instance, it gave me some really good tools about things that I could do to get started on that journey. And I could further refine that as I got further along in that journey. Here is a related one that I found was really useful that comes up pretty commonly, may or may not impact some of you. But if I've worked primarily on traditional waterfall projects, this is changing a lot because the world has changed a lot in terms of moving towards Agile ways of working. But there's still a lot of folks who have managed traditional waterfall type project management projects. Ask GenAI, my next project's going to be an Agile one. I could Google that, but if I really want some good ideas, what I use in this example here, I think is a great thing to just ask. Just like I was asking a person. I asked my friend, I'm putting my buddy Johnny on the spot. But I say, hey, Johnny, this is my first Agile project is coming up. I know you're an expert in Agile ways of working. This is new to me. What should I do to get prepped? Like, I'm not expecting to get everything that I need out of this, but where would I get started? Sometimes I don't even know. So if I'm going to somebody like an expert counterpart, Johnny would probably say things like what you see here. Well, here's some key differences. This is the stuff you do today in your waterfall project management approaches. In the area of planning, here's what the waterfall approach looks like. Here's how it could be in an Agile construct. Project phases, here's what it looks like for how you do that today. Here's what's going to be different. And that's a really good way for me to, at the highest level, without going into a lot of detail, to understand those big conceptual changes. But again, that idea of the contextual superpower. So this was my first input, but in this one, it was like, there was a reference in here about stakeholders, and I want to get some guidance. I saw something in there that I thought was really interesting. How can I get some more guidance about how to best engage stakeholders in an agile project? Because right now, in my traditional project management, I'm managing stakeholder communication in a very prescribed, defined way, project status reports and all of that stuff. What do I do differently in agile ways of working to help make that more compatible with agile ways of working as far as stakeholder engagement? So I go ahead and I just put that input in. And then here is where it provides, again, those comparisons. So I've got my waterfall context, but I can compare that side by side in these different areas, this regular communication. So when I say stakeholder engagement, it gives me multiple areas. Again, without me asking what these areas are: regular communication, iterative feedback. There are obviously more items underneath those first two, but it's providing these side-by-side comparisons. So I've got my current context of how I work today in these particular subsections compared to agile ways of working. How helpful is that for me to get started and getting comfortable with what's going to be different in agile ways of working? And so I've got those ideas, and on each of these, I can keep using that context if there's something interesting. If I wanted to know, like in this example, what sprint planning looks like or sprint reviews, I could just use that and chain off of that answer to say, tell me more about how I engage stakeholders in a sprint review for greatest effectiveness, those sorts of things. So hopefully those were helpful. Those are some things that I found when I was kicking off a new project in traditional or agile ways. I wish these tools were available. I don't do as much of that anymore, but how nice would it be for me to provide that little bit of context and have it do all of those things that you just saw me talk through? It generated them, in 10% of the time that I took walking through them, it generated all of those things for me to start working on. How much time and effort does that save you, even if you know the type of project work that you're going to be doing? But how much even more so would it provide if it's something that's a new type of project for you? So hopefully those are some useful ideas for all of you. This is the area that I had mentioned earlier, especially that there's so much that's changing in this landscape that about every day for the last couple of weeks before I was doing this session, I'm like, I need to check and make sure that there's nothing that's new out here. Maybe I need to add some new examples. These are actually still from my original one back from January, but there's a lot more that are out there that I'm sure many, if not all of you, have seen a lot of the updates in terms of how this is being applied. But there's still a lot of hype there. So as I mentioned, I have a generalized allergy to that. I like to see what it can do in the real world, hype aside. What can it do to help make the work that we do today easier, more efficient, more accurate, more effective? So Microsoft's IntelliCode uses AI, provides code suggestions real time so that devs can write higher quality code more quickly. All of these things are in production use today by companies that you know. Facebook is using Prophet, an AI forecasting tool, to predict software bugs and performance issues before they occur. I really personally am interested in understanding more about that. That just sounds sort of amazing. Automated testing. This is an area where a lot of orgs struggle in terms of having good and up-to-date automated regression tests. So Uber is using Test AI to automatically generate and run those test cases. How awesome is that, to make sure we have good coverage so we can move quickly? Natural language processing for user stories. So AI is using AI. Salesforce is using AI-driven analytics to do analysis against user stories to make sure that the requirements are understandable and actionable. Spotify is using predictive analytics for sprint planning. Slack is incorporating AI-powered chatbots. I just posted, one of my friends who's actually in the call, Robin Yarrow, posted a blog post for one of our partner organizations, and they actually have integrated an internal tool in Slack for an AI-powered chatbot using ChatGPT, I believe, maybe Claude. But that was awesome. But things that can really help with the Slack communication that we have. I don't get rid of Slack, but this helps with a lot of that communication and facilitation. Code generation, GitHub's Copilot assists developers in generating code. I haven't used this plugin Doxygen, but again, as PMs, we're always going to have, whether it's lightweight or heavyweight documentation. Some of these plugin tools can really help generate documentation so that we still have it, but we don't have to have human beings doing that slog of creating it. And then again, I hate calling human beings resources, but resource allocation optimization, TalentSoft using analytics for workforce planning. While I don't like the label, I love the idea of using these tools to understand that how we have the right level, the right skill sets based on historical project data. Risks and limitations of AI, I think, are really important, and I'll go through these quickly, but these are things to be cognizant of now that I've gotten you hopefully excited about using some of these tools. Now I'm going to sort of kill the vibe a little bit, but just things to be cognizant of. Move forward, but move forward thoughtfully. So as much as I talked about context, there's a different type of context that it won't have contextual understanding. The danger that I found, and I mentioned that I worked for an AI company quite some time ago, the thing that terrified me about that technology then, still does now, is that it can be, like a lot of human beings, myself sometimes, confident and wrong. So it won't tell you, I'm not sure about this. It will basically give you an answer that looks like it's accurate and is not. So be thoughtful about those responses. That's why I'm saying never use what you get as your final draft. Take it as a first draft and do a thoughtful review of it. Quality and accuracy. So again, it's based on models, and you're not always going to have perfection there. So if it's trained on bad data, you may get some bad data in terms of coding standards or best practices, but not just for code itself. In other areas, there can be quality and accuracy concerns to be cognizant of. Domain-specific knowledge. So in my example, I used something, like I said, that was a fairly common project. If you're doing something that's really unique with proprietary technologies, proprietary applications, it's only going to help so much because it's based on oodles and oodles and oodles and oodles of data. If your domain is that, a lot smaller, it's not going to have as much data against it. And so there's going to be practical limitations about what it can suggest because it just doesn't have enough data to be able to be informed in that context. And lack of creativity. This is a conversation probably for another day or another number of days, but I still believe that human beings truly are creative. It creates derivative works. It can create things that look like creations, but they are derivatives. They are composites. So using it to get your creativity going is great. Using it to outsource your brain and your heart, I would not recommend. Some other risks and limitations, ethical concerns. So again, it's based on the data that's out there. A lot of that data is not so good. It has things like biases. So be cognizant of that. Unfortunately, there's a lot of biases out there. And so that means it's going to be baked into the models. Over automation. So again, don't outsource your brain or your heart to these tools. You have to be thoughtful about what you're dealing with the responses. I think we've all seen some interesting instances lately of lawyers being sanctioned for citing case law that doesn't actually exist. Those are the areas where we have to be careful. And that also falls into the limited validation as well. One last consideration, input privacy. So a lot of organizations have policies against using the tools. Adhere to your company's policies, of course. Even if there's no policy, understand that the data that you're inputting in is by default being added to their model. So be careful about anything that is sensitive, confidential, but also HIPAA, healthcare coverage, PCI, PII. If you know the alphabet soup of these things, you know of the things of which I speak, GDPR, other related items where you have some issues about putting data out in a public forum. It is effectively public. By default, ChatGPT will use your input to improve their models. It's not documented. I found this out by accident. But if you have ChatGPT in the bottom left-hand corner, you won't see my name, hopefully. But where you see yours, go to settings. There's an option that says chat history and training under data controls. If you toggle that off, it'll temporarily lose your chat history, but whatever you input from when you turn that off will not be will not be fed into their model and will not be used to improve their model. When you re-enable it, you'll have chat history for prior chats when that option was enabled. So next steps, and then we'll get to the questions with whatever time we've got left. I suggest getting started. Just start. If you don't have any ideas, look to your last retro or your lessons learned session and see if there's something there that you might be able to use these tools to address an issue that's been identified. From there, experiment, experiment, experiment. Like I said, it's got an input box that looks like a search engine, but it's not. Don't treat it like one. Have a conversation and then evolve, iterate, just like I did, to really get to the heart of what you're trying to find. And then continue learning. There's great resources by organization. LitheSpeed has many. The PMI has some great free courses. So if you're a PMP or if you're part of a PMI chapter, you have those access to those courses for free. And there's other areas to improve learning.